Good evening, everybody. We are about to begin work on Unit 7, and in Unit 7, we're going to be looking at sections 16, 17, and 20 in the tutorials document and chapters 6 and 7 in your main textbook. I'm going to bring up the course shell just real quick here. So this is Unit 7 and what it looks like inside the course shell. And you can see our topics here basically focus on a couple categories. So one is this concept of validation. So we have worked with validation probably in many of your courses, and we're going to use this technology called data annotations in order to enable validation within our applications. We're going to look at how you enable that and how you tweak it to customize it. The other thing that we're going to work with is something we did way at the beginning, which is create an application that's got built-in login and authorization. And we're going to talk about those topics a little bit. And the sections 16 and 17 in the tutorials document will first deal with validation and then with security. Section 20 in the tutorials document deals with the whole concept of data annotations, where they go into some extensive examples using like a code first database approach and talk about all the square bracketed code variations that you can use to do the work. But there is no exercise attached to it, so there's no work for section 20. But it is an important chapter in terms of concepts, so count on there being material on a final exam when we get to that point. All right, so without further ado, let's jump into the tutorial document, section 16, which is on page 128 for you. And I'm just going to begin by just putting the document up on the screen here and talking about these concepts. And some of this should be repeat, at least in conception. But the techniques that we're using here are certainly different than the other languages that you've used. In fact, form validation is kind of one of those things that was an initial challenge to people writing web applications. Because if you think about how web applications work, we're dealing with a protocol that is stateless. So that means that when you interact with a website, the web browser itself and the whole protocol that moves the data is not capable natively of keeping track of your session or who you are or if you're logged in or how you're interacting with the server. It's not possible for it to do it. So what they've done over time is they've run server-side code to be able to enable that capability in combination with front-end code, which cleans up whatever content you're putting into the form before it goes back to the server to go into a database or for the next step of whatever you're doing. So the concept's been around a long time, and in the old days, pretty much the only way that we could do validation was either to do it on the server directly. So in other words, we'd put up a web form, the person would type in their stuff, you'd hit submit, it gets sent off to the server intercepts it, and there's some code there that checks it. Later on, when they added JavaScript into the mix, all of a sudden we discovered that we could do some of that on the front end. We could do it directly on the page that's in the client's browser, run a little bit of JavaScript code, and more often than not, that code just simply check to see, did they put anything in the box? If they're signing up for something, it's kind of nice to have their name, that type of thing. Later on, when HTML5 came about, all of a sudden we saw HTML5 have the capabilities to do validation within the form elements directly. So for example, you could add a little tag to your input box, whether it's a text box or a checkbox or whatever, and just say required. And then that was a real primitive form of validation. But you know what? It works great. And a lot of people have moved to that approach. But the truth is, when you are writing applications, especially one that's connected to a database, you run into this situation where databases are very finicky about the kind of data that they work with, right? So if you have a field that's a varchar or an integer or what have you, if you send the wrong information into the database, you're going to get a database error. And in many cases, if you don't write code to handle that error, it makes your whole application stop dead in its tracks. That is not acceptable on the web. It just is not. So what we do is we put in multiple layers of validation along the way to make sure that the information is in the right format, that it's filled in when it needs to be, and that it's in a format that the database will accept it and work with. And in some cases, you might even need to do conversions to make it sit right. So the whole point of that is to keep the application running smoothly, to take a little bit of the load maybe off the server and let the front end do it, but there's layers, right? And ultimately the database will control where the data is. But the hope is that you're not making the database do that work. Really, if you write your application correctly, the database should just work with the data that you're sending it because you're sending the right thing. Okay, so that's kind of the background concept of it all. All right, now remember, we have this don't repeat yourself principle that is part of the whole MVC thing. Yes, it's included with ASP.NET, but really it's a principle of the whole MVC architecture. And the whole point is not to have to do things over and over again, that you find things that you can do once and then just use them over and over again rather than recreate the code every time, right? Why reinvent the wheel is really kind of the mindset. So when we are writing, let's say, an application like the one that we've been working with, sometimes we have to do things such as what I mentioned, which is, let's say you're signing up for something and you're putting your name in there, right? If you're signing up for something, having of the information that you're putting in. So for example, if you happen to be John Smith, right, and you're filling out first name, last name, no big deal, right? Usually your name is short enough, it fits into whatever parameters they've set up. But if you've done database design, especially when you're dealing with legacy systems, you're going to find that some databases will have fields that are truncated in length on purpose. And it used to be some of that related directly to, for example, if you were creating an address list, and you'd have a first and last name, and then a street address, a city, state, all that stuff. We would truncate it down because we knew that if we were to take that information and have it print onto a mailing label, that our printing software could only print so many characters. So it didn't make sense to give somebody more than, like, let's say 12 characters for a first name, 20 characters for a last name, maybe 30 characters for an address, and then, oh, if they go beyond 30, we'll give them address 2, you know, that type of thing, right? So we would actually set up our databases to have certain limitations. The good news is that the modern approach often doesn't even truncate how long something is. We don't even declare it in many cases. In some cases you do, but you have to be mindful of that. If you know what the database is supposed to receive, you don't want to be pumping more. You don't want to be pumping 30 characters into something that only accepts 20. You're just asking for problems. And then what is it that you're truncating? So you see why that's important. Another possibility is the use of regular expressions. Now, regular expressions are this really kind of bizarre language. And in fact, if you don't know what a regular expression is, you can Google it. So if you look up regular expressions, and I'm just Wikipediaing it, and this is not the one, well, this is a regular expression right here. That's the format of it. And what it basically is it sets up a pattern for the information that you're feeding. So whether it's numbers, letters, capitals, you can set up regular expressions. There's a whole syntax to it, for example, to validate an email address. So if I were to put together an HTML5 form element that's a text box, and I say type email, there's a built-in regular expression that knows to check for some text, an @ sign, some text, a period, some more text, to make sure that it's really in the format of an email address. Now, we used to write those things manually. We would write them in whatever language you want. And regular expressions are kind of interesting because you can use them in just about any programming language. But we used to write them in JavaScript, we used to write them in Java, we used to write them in PHP, and you guys may have done all of those, depending on your teacher. And you know what? You can buy books like 3 inches thick on regular expressions and the usage and formats for them. But with HTML5's like built-in validation, a lot of that is now kind of going out the window because you can just hit a little box that says type email and it knows to check for it. You're writing no code. It's beautiful, actually. I really like it. But the fact is that sometimes you get these more complicated things that you do need to enter, and sometimes you can use those regular expressions in your code. Another thing that's more on the new end of things is entering in things within a range. So for example, if let's say you're applying for Social Security, so I'm reaching, maybe that's not a good example, or a driver's license. You're going to exclude some age ranges probably. I don't know if there's an upper limit for a driver's license. I assume probably not, but maybe in some states there are where they don't let people over a certain age drive. Does anybody even know? I'm not even sure. Well, but certainly you can declare ranges for things too. So you would check to see if something sits within a range, and that's a special type of consideration as well. All right. Now, that's just actually an example of the types of validation checking that we do. And probably more common is to check, I think, is something even there or not? And then is it in the right data format? So is it a string or is it a number? Well, here's the trick, folks. Anything that's typed into a web form, even if it's a number, is what? It's a string. And then it's up to the coders or the framework that you're using to intercept that value and convert it into the value that it needs to be. So anything coming off of a form by default is a string. And in some cases, when you work with certain languages, you do have to implicitly state, convert from the form, parse it as a string, and convert it to integer or float or whatever the case may be. And you have to be cognizant of that, and it goes along with the database design of things. All right, now they're going to have us do some work here right off the bat, and we're going to be working with the application that we've been using for the sections preceding 16. So the stuff that we've been doing in 13, 14, 15, working with the employees, that's the application that we're building off of. So we're going to be tweaking that. So if you can go ahead and go to your Visual Studio and open up the application that we were using. And on my system, I, of course, have called it Simple App. Now, I will tell you one thing that I've been doing that I kind of take for granted. Okay. When you took ASP.NET 1 with me, maybe, right? Every single time we opened up our application, what did I have you do? Make a backup, right? And you know what? What have I not been doing at all? I'm not making any backups. I'm flying by the seat of my pants. And you know what? Wrong approach, folks. Wrong approach. So really what you should do, if you're following along with me, is probably close your Visual Studio really quick, find the folder location where you're storing your work, and for me, it's here. This is the folder that I'm working in. And what I'm going to do is it's a very simple technique. It's a primitive one, actually, is I'm just going to copy that folder, paste it back in. There's a little bit more stuff in there than you might think there is. Thank you to the database components and all the DLLs that are built in. Thank you, Entity Framework and jQuery. All right, so it's done making the copy, and now I have a copy. And what would be smart to do with your copies is you could date them, or you could say, like my pattern typically is I name it with where it's complete. So I would maybe say section 15 complete. And then I just leave that one alone. And then if I screw up what I'm working on now, I go back to that one and I'm all set. And you guys should be aware of the fact that, yes, manually is probably the most primitive approach to do it. And And a lot. How did I create the copy? All I did, Tom, is I just simply right-clicked it, the folder, copy, and then paste right back into the same folder. Now, for some of you, you actually picked up on that good habit from the last time you've taken courses with me, which is really a smart move. But you know, it just shows you that it's easy to forget to do it, especially if you're hurrying to do something. But I'm going to tell you what, it's those times that you forget to do it when it's going to come back and bite you. And then if you screw up the only version you have, then your only option then becomes to rebuild from the beginning. And you don't want to be in that situation because it's a lot of work. So little preemptive medicine here, if you want to think of it that way. The other thing I want to point out, folks, is that's not the only way to do it. In fact, there are what we call versioning tools available to the public for free. The biggest versioning tool out there is what, you guys? Most popular? It's called GitHub. You guys heard of that service, right? And if you don't have an account, you might want to entertain getting one. So if you just type GitHub, it'll take you right to the site. And really what this is it's a platform for sharing code. It's free to sign up. The only catch is when you use a free account, the whole world can see your stuff. Okay? Which for most people, it doesn't really matter because you're working on homework. But what's the worst thing that's going to happen is somebody's going to jump into your code and make a comment saying you did it wrong. But see, the positive thing here is with having like GitHub or other services that compete, like, for example, Bitbucket. That's another real big one. Is the fact that you can directly connect these tools to GitHub or Bitbucket. So there's actually tools built within here, and you guys see this whenever you click New, there's a little checkbox that says Use versioning control. And then you go ahead and you sign into your GitHub account, and it creates a folder out on the repository, and every time you hit save, all the work automatically gets pushed out there. You don't even have to think about it. How wonderful is that? Not only that, but it keeps the versions separate. So it recognizes when you last saved, and it can go back a version automatically. I don't usually take the time in class to show this technology, but I'm kind of thinking more and more that maybe I should take that time. Got to identify which course is best to do it in. But I'm just mentioning that because it is a way to work. So go ahead and open up your application again so we can get working on the actual code here. If you have questions about GitHub or Bitbucket, or you want to explore that, you can talk to me like when we're taking a break or in between what we're doing here. But that is a tool that most professionals use. The other thing I just want to mention about it really quickly, the only way to privatize your stuff on GitHub is to pay, right? And a lot of professionals do. That's why some people prefer Bitbucket, because you can privatize your work without having to pay. And those are just probably the two most popular services. There's many, many others that you can use. The other technique, the one that I'm using to keep my work safe, is I'm storing stuff on OneDrive instead of on my local hard drive. So any machine I go to, I can get to my projects. Really, it's as simple as that. Yeah, but yeah, that's the catch there, Ryan. You're correct that there's no versioning there. The versioning is manual. But I learned how to just manually version things by screwing things up royally. I mean, there's no other way to really put it. Where I would have like done complete projects and then make one little boo-boo, the whole thing blows up, and I have nothing to go back to. And then because I was contracted to do the work, I would just go back and do the work again, right? And hopefully it turned out better or as good. Who's to know? But man, it doesn't have to happen too many times before you learn that lesson. And I'm just trying to keep you guys from making that mistake because it happens all the time. All right, let's get to where we're actually doing the work here. And what they want us to look at here is an update to the employee class file. So that would be the one entitled employee CS. And that is our model file, which is this one here. And what we're going to do is we're going to add some different annotations. So that's the stuff, when we say annotations, we're talking about things that go into square brackets. Those are called annotations that give us special capabilities because of the framework that we're working in. So one thing that we do need to do is do some updates here. And some stuff you're going to notice, like for example, and I'm going to pull the document back over. All right, so take a look at the header of the document. And notice how, like on my code, some of my code is grayed out. So you see like system collections generic, system.link, system.web. Those are grayed out. The reason for that is this framework requires that they're present, otherwise this file will just not work, period. Right? So those aren't really the ones we're worried about. And just because those do not exist here doesn't mean that we're going to delete them here. All this means is that we're actually going to just add one. We're going to add this one here. And if you don't add it, of course, Visual Studio will highlight in red and probably give you a hint to add it in. But since we know we're going to use it, why not just add it? So let's drop that in at the top. And yes, right now it's going to identify that, hey, you're not using it yet. Okay, not a big deal. From there, we're going to go class by class here, so for each structure, and make sure that everything is correct. So I'm looking at first employee, and I see that my first field, which is the ID field, that gets left alone. Then I notice that there's an annotation inserted right after this that says this. I'm just going to paste it in, and this comes right from the PDF. And notice, it doesn't take a genius to figure this one out. What does this one say? Yeah, you reversed your words a little bit, but I know that you know what it is. You just didn't say it quite right. It has to be at least 3 characters long and at most 60 characters long. Okay. Now, is that for the ID? No. Yeah, so that's a trick with the annotations, is this annotation actually refers to the field that follows it. So the annotation comes first and then the field that follows. So for the name, they're saying at most 60 and at least 3. All right. Then we have a series of them. And I'm going to add them in one at a time and talk about each. As you see, the next field is the joining date. So the first one I'm pasting in, I guess I didn't copy, so let me copy. First one I'm pasting in is this one. So it says display name, joining date. What do you suppose that does? How about it just takes the name of the field, and instead of having it shown with no space, it forces it to show a space in between. That's all. That's so that when you generate your database views in the browser, the name that appears at the top of the column is just readable. Next piece we're pasting in, once again related to the date, is this. Now we're declaring an actual data type for the field. Now you're going to say, wait, it already has a data type because right here it says public, date, time. Right, but then it also helps us to enforce how it pulls up in the form field when we're pulling it in. So the form field understands that it's this format, so that helps us, and you'll see the result of it. It's actually better to show you than to tell you. And one more that goes with this one, once again, and this is for the display format of the date. So check that one out. So in this case, it shows us, and what's fascinating about this is it's basically saying that we have to have a 4-digit year, 2-digit month, 2-digit day. And it says apply format and edit mode true. And really, once again, this is one of those things you have to see in action. It basically, when you're in the field typing it in, it guides you. And you've seen this in applications because everybody uses this when they write .NET applications because it's there. Okay, so it's a beautiful tool that you can make your application seem really cool. Now, not to be prejudiced by age, but looks like they're going to be prejudiced by age here. For the age field, yeah, they don't want old people, and they don't want really young people. So they're not going to hire anybody less than 22. That seems kind of weird to me, but and they're not going to hire anybody over 60. That also seems kind of weird to me, those ranges. So if you want to change them, it doesn't matter. But what they're trying to show you is that there's only a certain range that they're going to accept. Okay? Simple as that. So if you have made those changes, please go ahead and save the work. Now the next step of the process is that we also need to tweak our database in order to tell the database to have those limitations as well. Okay? So really, and this is kind of backwards, in a real application, especially if you're connecting to a database that pre-exists, you'll probably get requirements from your database administrator that'll say, here's an output of all the fields, this is what they take, so this one takes this many characters, this one's an integer, this one's a whatever, and you have those requirements already. Here we're kind of doing it backwards, right? Because we're designing the database and the code, and we just happen to do the code first, right? And there's that term again. And that's okay, as long as you know to go to the database and fix it at the same time. Now, in order to find the actual database, you do need to bring up your database Explorer. So you want to bring up the SQL Server Object Explorer. And I want you to keep something in mind here as that tool comes up. Some of you discovered last time when you were working on section 15 that if you've already installed SQL Server on your machine, the full-blown product, and it's running in the background, chances are your database is in that structure, in the SQL Server database structure. If you do not have SQL Server installed, like me, I don't install it on this machine because I think it's a memory hog. So I don't install it. I usually connect to external ones. So in that case, we're going to be looking in a different spot for the database. But either way, your SQL Server, if it's running on your machine, will pop up in this SQL Server window. For us, most likely, it'll be in this first implementation. So you see the simple app, models, employee, database, DB context. I can open up the tables. I can find my employee table. I can right-click it, and I can view the data inside of it. Right, if you guys remember that stuff. And then I can also go into the designer mode, which is where the book is. And then when you're in the designer mode, then you can adjust the database fields or columns to have certain attributes. So that is what we're going to do. So what they would like us to do is to set the name property, which is nvarchar, is set to max. Now, I don't know what max is. It might be something ridiculous like 64,000 characters or 256. I mean, I don't know what it is, frankly, these days. It's changed so often. But they want us to change that And do they actually give us the value that they want us to type in? Okay, I'll show you how I got there. In fact, why don't I pause for a sec and show you. All right, so now that we have this view up on screen, and I did get asked, how did I get there? And I'm just going to retrace those steps just really quick. I initially went to the View menu. I made sure to choose SQL Server Object Explorer. That opens up this panel here, which you may have already had a tab open for it, for all you know. But that connects to all your locally running databases and creates a list. Mine, because I'm using the SQL Server that's bundled with Visual Studio, I'm choosing the one that says MS SQL Local DB. And it is basically SQL Server Express that's bundled with Visual Studio. If you have a full-blown SQL Server, you're going to have a separate entry for that in there. And then what you do is you dig down, expand the tree. So I expanded it, opened up databases, found my simple app. You can see it named MVC Simple App. And then I found the table, and then I did a right click. First I did a view data to look inside, and then I did a view designer to get this view. Now the point here isn't that we're going to make the changes here. That's not the point. Although you could. Okay, that's a possible solution. What they're going to show you how to do is this process called migration, where we are going to write code that is going to tell the database to update. Okay? If any of you have happened to do the Ruby on Rails class, and Ryan, did you do that class? Yeah. And in that class, that was a common thing. So every time we'd make a change to a model, then you run a database migration, and it writes that change to the database. So in other words, you can dictate the change with code, which is really what we're doing in the class files. Just think about this. We are taking this file, and all of a sudden, instead of just listing a bunch of fields, we are putting in all these other, we're putting in lengths, forcing data types, forcing formats, choosing a range, all in advance. And remember, our database table was built from this, right? We created the code first, we ran the application, and then it built the database for us. Now what we're going to do is we made a change that happens when you write applications, and we're going to enable the capability now to allow for migrations to happen for an active application. And then once we run what we call the migration, it'll go through, send code to the database, make the changes to the table that match up with the data annotations that we just added here. Okay, that's the procedure conceptually. All right, so let's go through that process. So I'm at the very, very bottom of 129, going on to page 130 in the tutorial document. If you use the PDF page numbers, it says page 136, but it's page 130 in the actual document. So now they want us to actually open up what we call the Package Manager console. You guys may have used this tool before, or maybe not. So the place that you find that typically is under the Tools menu. And then you notice down here where we say NuGet Package Manager. You guys have probably used that tool before too. And then one of the options is the Package Manager console. And when you click that, it creates a console window at the bottom of the screen. And notice the prompt says PM. And yes, this is a command prompt that's internal to the application, whose purpose it is to allow you to execute or bring other components into your application. So like if you had jQuery, a lot of times you just like right click, NuGet, search for jQuery, click install, boom, it's there, right? That's the newfangled way to do it. Old school way to do it is we would go to the command line and type it in. And with the tool that we're about to use, that's what they're going to demonstrate. So if you scroll down then, you'll notice that you need to type the following commands. I'm going to type them in one at a time. So the first one is enable dash migrations. All right, notice capital E, capital M with a dash in between. In fact, the dash in between is a pretty common thing for a lot of this. And I'm going to press enter now, right? And I do want to say that whenever you run the console like this, whether it's the graphical version or the command line version, this is attaching only to the currently open project. Not everything you do, just the current project. Pressing enter. We're enabling migrations. All right. And notice I'm being patient here. I'm not typing the next command because it's actually doing stuff in the background. All right. And then check the output. All right. So it says enable migrations, checking if the context target existing database, detect the database created with database, blah, 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 blah. All right. And it gives you a bunch of stuff. Okay, great. Thank you. So now we're going to go ahead. It basically worked is what it's telling you. We're going to type the next command, which is add migration space data annotations. So now we're going to type that command and press enter. What this piece does is it now looks for the change in the file. And one thing, I'm going to tell you what, one thing I did forget to do is did I save that file? Right. So I'm going to look in there. I did save it, thankfully. But you should have saved your file first if I didn't mention that, because that's kind of important. All right, so now we got that part done. And then finally, we run the command, oops, not up in the code window, down here. That's update database. And basically, so the procedure here is like, flip the switch. Yes, you can do migrations. Then look for the data annotations. Found them. All right, you ready to go? All right, update the database. And by running this command, all right, and I want you to notice something because this is actually a commonality that you're going to see in most MVC applications regardless of platform, is whenever you're creating what we call a migration, it goes through and those annotations that we put in actually create a file. And notice the file names at the bottom of the screen, the ones in the square brackets. So it's a time and date stamp. So it's year, month, day, and then 24-hour clock and seconds, right? And then the name of whatever it is we called it. In this case, by running this command, we decided to name it data annotations. When we worked in Ruby on Rails, those of you that maybe took that course, it was automatically attached to whatever model we were creating. So usually, like if we made a change to, let's say, the user database, we would call it user migration or something like that. So the name would make sense. Here the name is kind of generic and I'm not really a fan of that. So if I were really doing it like myself, I would probably call it employee, or maybe even employee table or something like that. And that way the time and date stamp also attaches itself to the name of the model you're changing. And then when you run the annotation or the upgrade to the database, it's all named. So that way you can look back at your log files, you can look back at your files and say, oh, I did this one on that date and this one on this date, and it makes sense. This is generically named because it's, simple, basically. That's not really the approach I would recommend. At the end of the whole process, it does what we call a seed method. And in some cases, when you're doing this, you feed information into the database. So not only are you changing a table, but you're also inserting data at the same time. So migrating is changing the tables. Seeding is adding information. Now, because we are changing the structure of the table, but yet we still have information that's already in there, we also run the risk that the information that's already in there is no good. So when you see the seed running, what it's really doing is it's taking the pre-existing information and grabbing it and putting it back in. See the logic there, right? Because we're changing the table. It's kind of like if you're remodeling a house. it's kind of nice to get the people out first, knock down the walls, and then put the people back in. Hopefully they fit. That's conceptually what's going on here. And let me ask, did everybody's work okay so far? Okay. I don't hear any complaining, so I assume that's a good sign. All right. The other thing that's going to happen is when we run these commands, I want you to notice that actually is a file. So even though we created that class file, right, this one, where we put the annotations in, it also created this file, which is the actual annotations themselves. So this is the file that does the migration, that dictates the migration. And then if you look in here, what it does is it adds the commands necessary to make the work happen. All right. Now, if you want to make sure that worked, what you want to do is you want to come back here. And now, granted, these are already open, right, where we see the data. But let's go ahead and actually right-click and view the designer now after the fact. And now notice how the name field, which was previously set to max, is now set to what? 60. So that shows us that our migration worked, folks. All right, next part of this is for us to actually run the application and make sure we didn't break anything. Okay, but did you notice what I did? I closed my tabs where it was open already, and then I reinitiated them. The other option is to refresh, but I don't always trust that with a database. So what I did is I closed the tabs for the database. I came back to the table, did a right click, and then I did view designer, and then it was updated. How about now? Okay, good. Because I know the very first time I did it, right, it's like you're looking at an old snapshot. And unfortunately, for whatever reason, in all these years of like running databases, I mean, you guys have worked in SQL Server before, right? And you're looking at a table, you always have to remember to hit refresh. Like if you do, like you drop a table or add a table or something, you always have to hit refresh to make sure it actually happened. This is no exception, no exception. And part of that, frankly, is how databases work with their data. Because databases, even though all their stuff might be in one file technically, you can dynamically change little pieces of it and have them saved to the structure without reloading the whole thing. That's how databases work. So that's why you have to do a refresh to make sure you're getting the latest view. All right, let's go ahead and run the application. And what they want us to do now is they want us, of course, our index page, and we should probably fix this so we don't get an error when we launch it, is they want us to go to the employees page and then do a create. And in the instructions, they say just go directly to the URL employees/create. So if you want to do it that way, that's fine. I'm going to actually type in employee and then click the create link. And then you're going to discover that you should not be able to enter in a name that's more than 60 characters long. So you might have to do a little bit of typing to get there to test it, right? So I'm going to go to employee create. And it should pull up the form. All right. And what it wants us to do is enter in invalidate. And now one way to do it is to type in 61 characters. But don't forget, we put in a range of 3 to 60. It's easier to type 2 characters to make it fail than it is to type 61. So I'm going to be kind of smart, and that's what the book did too. So I'm just going to type in 2 characters. And then instead of a joining date, you know what? Hey, isn't that cool? I can't even type in the wrong stuff here. I'm trying right now to type letters into there. And it just won't let me. How slick is that, right? That's really, folks, that's actually really good application design. because the user has no option but to put in valid data. And then, what was the age range we had? I'll be 12 years old, right? So I'm intentionally trying to put wrong information into each one just to trigger the validation. Now the middle one, for me, it's I don't know if you guys are able to type letters in there, but for me, it's absolutely impossible. All right, but I did trigger the validation. And notice what it does. Did I type those messages? No. The engine is intelligent enough to do it for us. I just love it, right? Because not only, like with older coding techniques, PHP, JavaScript, you name it, not only would you have to type the validation code, but then you'd also have to come up with a message that actually made sense for what you just did. And probably even set up a bunch of like case statements and if statements to handle different scenarios. Too long, too short, just right, you know. So if you want to make it okay, go ahead and actually put the stuff in the correct ranges and click create, and then you'll see that it is added indeed to your database and to the application. Now the fascinating thing is the error messages that are generated by the validation are actually done in jQuery. So jQuery actually has validation libraries, and that's where the magic is coming from, you guys. So somebody's like pre-created this stuff. It's not Microsoft that's the brilliant one here. It's the jQuery people that are the brilliant ones here. But as with all brilliance, you know, when you see something that's good that you can use for free, why not, right? Everybody does it. And that's how applications are built these days. And yes, you can customize the stuff if you wish. All right, if you've completed that, you've successfully completed section 16. And we're going to take a break here in class, and this video ends here.